Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. This episode occurred on the island of Kunshur in the Kuril island chain currently governed by Russia, but just north of the Japanese island of Hokkaido. Kunshur is a largely undeveloped place with volcanoes, hot springs, and picturesque scenery. Oh, and bears. Lots of bears. The evening of October 22nd, 2019, Alexei Ivanovsky and several of his friends were out for a little R&R to take a break from the Russian army base on the island. One of their favorite activities was to go along the shore and catch crabs and cook them for dinner. The group brought the necessary equipment, which included waders, buckets, and small shovels. They were in for an easy day, or so they thought. The crabbing party was pulling in quite a haul throughout the day and were excited about their dinner plans. The group was a little spread out along the vast beach, but within shouting distance of each other. Alexei was on a small hill of sand and searching out crabs by himself. To find the crabs, you have to locate small tunnels that they hide in. Then you have to carefully reach in and grab the crab by the back of its body. Otherwise, it can pinch you with its claws. As Alexei focused on gathering the last couple of crabs he would need to top off his bucket, he didn't pay as much attention to his surroundings as he should have. This late in the fall, many bears are fat and getting ready to den for hibernation for the winter. If bears are around at this time of year, it's likely because they are not fat enough to hibernate and are desperate to find more food to survive the winter. As Alexei dug around in the sand, all the activity he and the others were participating in had drawn the attention of a sow bear with her cubs. They hadn't had enough food to build up their fat and were very hungry. This heightened state of awareness had them focusing on Alexei and his friends. The sow bear headed up a short swale that led her to just behind Alexei, while her cubs circled him from the other direction. By the time Alexei saw them, they had completely surrounded him, and he had nowhere to go. The sow slowly stalked up to the man, who was now facing her. She jumped a bit closer to him and clamped her powerful jaws onto his lower leg. Alexei screamed and drew the attention of his friend, who came to save him. The bear saw the people coming toward her and her cubs with their victim, and she dragged him off a short distance. The sow immediately started to bite and claw Alexei all over his body. Suddenly, she focused her attack on his head and started tearing and removing Alexei's scalp from the back of his head. She pulled and tore his entire scalp and continued to pull the hide from his back. He covered his face and lay prone, trying to protect himself, but she was ravenous and had to feed her cubs as well as herself. She pulled and bit and eventually tore all of his skin from his shoulders and continued until she had pulled all the skin from his back. He couldn't feel the pain due to the adrenaline, but was in a dire situation. Next, the sow started pulling the skin from Alexei's buttocks and claws it away from his body, leaving him without any skin on the parts of his body she could access. Still facing the ground, Alexei was terrified, and efforts to resist her seemed to energize her more. She finally began chewing on his right leg and tore off flesh and skin, trying to flip him over, her claws and jaws utterly destroying his thigh muscle. By now, Alexei's friends had arrived at the violent and bloody attack scene. They pelted the bears with rocks in a vain attempt to save Alexei. Alexander, one of Alexei's friends, tried to save his friend so fervently that he was wounded by the bear, but nothing very serious. In a last-ditch effort, Alexei's friends got into the vehicle and drove it up to the bear and shined the headlamps in an attempt to frighten the bear. After some time, the tactic worked, and she and her cubs slowly left the area. Alexei's friends began administering basic first aid while help was summoned. As his friends were trying to take care of him, Alexei died, but the first responders resuscitated him. Alexei was bandaged up the best they could, and then they rushed him to the medical helicopter. They flew him 250 miles to the hospital in Yunzo-Sakhalinsk. Alexei survived for 9 days as the doctors sutured him and amputated his destroyed leg, as well as reattached his ear that was torn off in the attack. He received antibiotics to fight off any infection he may have contracted from the attack. Alexei managed to hold on for 9 days of intensive medical attention, but eventually succumbed to his wounds and had a heart attack. Alexei's attack spawned a tremendous outcry, and many people rushed to donate blood and held prayer vigils in his honor. He left behind his wife and kids and his proud service to his country in the army. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the remote Siberian wilderness, a beautiful and wild place that we visited in our prior episodes, the Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia's Far East. The area is known as the Kronotsky Wildlife Reserve, not far from where our episode discussing Igor and Olga Moskalyova occurred. The geography of the peninsula is thick with alder and other scrub brush, as well as groves of pine, fir, and birch trees. Vitaly Nikolayenko was a 66-year-old bear researcher. He was a self-taught naturalist and wildlife photographer. This is his 33rd year living with brown bears and documenting their mating rituals, social interactions, and feeding habits. The The bears tolerated him and his intrusion into their environment, although he had to tumble down a few cliffs and climb some trees to avoid charging bears at times. He was a senior ranger working on the reserve and would spend several months each year at remote locations performing his research. Vitaly was renowned among the bear research sphere of scientists, filling hundreds of journals and thousands of pages with his observations, field notes, and illustrations. He traveled an estimated 1,000 kilometers per year through the wilderness of the reserve, warding off poachers and illegal fishermen. Vitaly documented over 800 bear contacts per year, and he knew many of the bears personally, if you will. His favorite was an older male he named Dobrynya, whom he would curl up near and sleep by on occasion. The year 2003 was a peculiar year, in that the bears had not gone into hibernation by late December. It was most likely due to an environmental cause, like a low salmon run or berry crop in the area. He was waiting for a helicopter out of the reserve for the season, from the warmth and safety of the park cabin he called home while on duty. While preparing some tea, Vitaly looked out the window and saw his old friend, Dobrynya, walking right past the cabin on the bear trail. He grabbed his camera and his skis and followed the slow-moving bruin toward the lake. He also brought his bear spray and his flare gun to scare the bear in case of a problem. Dobrynya slowly waddled his way up the snow-covered trail a few hundred yards ahead of Vitaly. The man always enjoyed listening to his bear friend's deep groans and rumbles as he was getting ready to rest, so Vitaly hurried to catch up. His cross-country skis allowed him to stay on top of the snow and slide across the crust, which helped him to make up ground on the bear. It only took about a mile before Vitaly saw Dobrynya's tracks entering into a thick grove of alders. He couldn't enter while standing up, nor on his skis, so he set them aside and crawled into the bush, just like the bears had to do. As he approached the bear, he moaned and gesticulated in the manner that he knew they would accept. He continued forward and snapped some pictures for his memory book. On the 1st of January of 2004, just a few days after Vitaly's reacquaintance with Dobrynya, the helicopter arrived at the cabin, but couldn't seem to find Vitaly. His tea was on the window still, but it was cold. He couldn't have gone far, but they called in a search team anyway. The search team arrived at the cabin and began following Vitaly's ski tracks toward the lake. After a mile or so, they found his skis sticking up vertically in the snow, obviously placed there. His tracks went into the alders, so the search team followed suit. Several yards into the grove, they found Vitaly's body, lying in the snow, not more than 3 yards from Dobrynya's bear bed. They could see the bear's tracks running toward the man, as well as the discharged orange color of the bear spray around Vitaly's body, with his unfired flare gun lying next to him. Dobrynya's 6.5-inch wide tracks right next to Vitaly's body embedded deeply into the snow. His broken and bloody camera now rested upon the blood-stained snow beside him. The rescue party brought him back for burial and goodbyes from his community. Vitaly's controversial observation methods were broadly criticized in the scientific circles, and his death seemed to be confirmation for his critics. Many of the bears he had made comfortable in his presence were killed by poachers shortly before and after his death. Just 2 months before Vitaly's death, Timothy Treadwell and his girlfriend were killed in Alaska. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. This episode takes us to familiar territory. If you've watched our previous stories on Olga Moskalyova, Vitaly Nikolayenko, and Alexei Ivanovsky, then you will know we are talking about the Russian Far East. We are returning to Kamchatka, to a beautiful place called Lake Kurilskoye. As you can see by our map, we are now near the center of 5 cases regarding attacks we previously discussed. The Senkabetsu bear attack on Hokkaido, Japan, the Kinshir Island attack, the Olga Moskalyova attack, and the Vitaly Nikolayenko attack, and then the topic of today's episode. If you're picking up on a pattern here, you're not the only one. These islands are some of the most sparsely populated areas when it comes to humans, yet we've documented some of the most tragic, violent, and unfortunate bear attacks ever. After today's episode, you may agree with me that this area of the world is most likely the most dangerous in regard to deadly bear attacks. The location is beautiful Lake Kurilskoye. With its clear waters and cool temperatures, it receives very few visitors each year. Any visitors that may find their way there might be photographers, researchers, and possibly fishermen. Otherwise, you can count on solitude, peace, and bears. Lots of bears. Michio Hoshino is an extremely accomplished wildlife photographer, observer, and researcher in his mid-40s. He was born in Japan and moved to Alaska to photograph brown bears in the 70s. His photos, videos, and artwork have brought the farthest corners of the world into the canvas and lighting of galleries around the world. In 1996, he was hired to do photography on a documentary about brown bears in Kamchatka. The first few days of filming went great, but on day 3, the photography crew lucked upon a very large male brown bear that did not mind the crew approaching within a few yards of him while he fished. The bear would simply ignore the crew, and they recorded some amazing footage of the giant bruin as it gorged itself on salmon just a few meager yards away from their lenses. The next day, they returned to the same spot, and there he was again. He seemed to relish the spotlight and played and showed off for the crews. He was not aggressive or threatening in any way, even though the photographers would sometimes approach within 5 yards to film him eating. The crew continued this for a third day and decided to make the hike to the lake to watch the big bear fish as part of their regular trip to gather footage. The big bear seemed content as he pulled in huge salmon and effortlessly tore them apart right in front of the crew. Some of these fish weighed about half as much as the men watching. It was on the 4th day, during the morning hike up the trail, that the crew noticed large piles of scat close to their camp in the trail to the big bear's fishing hole. They continued their hike and noticed his tracks and scat were placed over their boot tracks in the trail from when they returned to camp the prior day. Well, this is bear country, and we are hiking on a bear trail, so a certain amount of that can be expected. The photography crew went on about their filming trek for the day, but when they got to the big bear's fishing hole, he wasn't there. They were bummed, but they couldn't just return with a bunch of film of the same bear doing the same thing anyway. That would be boring. They finished up with a few shots of a sow and cubs that they watched for the afternoon and returned back to camp just before evening. As the men made it down the hill to the main trail back to camp, they noticed more bear scat. It was the big boar's tracks, and this time his tracks were in their boot tracks from their hike up this morning. That evening, the Russian guide asked Michio if he would please consider sleeping inside the cabin with the rest of the crew, as the presence of the bear tracks around camp indicated a potential for danger. Michio loved the sensation of being outside and sleeping in his tent under the stars, so he politely declined. After all, he had had over 20 years of filming and photography with bears and other wildlife this way, and wasn't feeling threatened by the presence of the bear. The guide deferred to the preferences of the experienced photographer, and they all retired to their beds for some rest and relaxation. After dinner and conversation, Michio made his way the short distance from the cabin back to his tent. He didn't have any food in his tent and nothing else tempting for bears like sweets or flavored drinks. He didn't pack a firearm and didn't see a need for bear spray while you're sleeping. He positioned his sleeping bag just beneath the window in the tent so he could stare out at the stars and feel the fresh air on his face while he slept. He curled up in his sleeping bag, in his tent, on the shore of Lake Kurill, and allowed the lapping of the water on the shore to lull him to sleep. As Michio slept, around 4 a.m., the big bear crept up on him and sniffed his scent through the tent window. Upon smelling Michio, the bear pounced on the sleeping man, biting his shoulder and swatting him with his paws. The bear tore apart Michio's tent while wrenching the man from his sleeping bag. Michio yelled in pain and woke his sleeping teammates. The Russian guide and other campers ran outside and watched by flashlight as Michio disappeared into the woods, dragging behind the running bear. The rest of the crew could only look on as their associate and friend's life was taken before their very eyes. Authorities were notified and recovery crews were assembled and helicoptered into the site. Michio's mutilated and partially consumed body was recovered as well as his tissues from the bear's stomach. The bear was put down at the site. The attack was deemed a strictly predatory attack. In fact, the bear followed and stalked the crew members for several days, as evidence shows. The world lost not only an amazing photographer, videographer, and children's book author, but a father, son, and husband. He is survived by his wife, Naoko, and a son, Homa, both of Fairbanks, Alaska, USA.